Welcome children. Today we are going to cover up the last topics of the chapter on market forms. We have studied the change in demand and market equilibrium, and we've also covered the change in supply and market equilibrium and when both demand and supply changes simultaneously. Today we are going to see few more cases about change in demand and market equilibrium. The first case when we are going to see is when supply is perfectly elastic. We all know when we talk about the word perfectly elastic, that means one or the other factor remains constant. Here, the price you can see in the graph is constant. When supply is perfectly elastic, then change in demand does not affect the equilibrium price. That means originally, if the quantity demanded is OQ or the quantity supplied is OQ and the price is OP, the point that is equilibrium, it remains unchanged because of the price being constant. It only changes the equilibrium quantity. That means if it changes from OQ to OQ1, the equilibrium point will shift only because of quantity and not because of the price. So the original equilibrium is determined at point E when the original demand curve, that is your original demand curve is DD, and the perfectly elastic supply curve SS, this is a perfectly supply curve, intersect each other, we get an equilibrium point. The first case we are going to see under this is increase in demand. When demand increases, the demand curve shifts to the right from the demand curve to demand 1 curve. If you can see this particular rightward shift, it changes to the right hand side because of the increase in quantity that is demanded. The supply curve is a horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis. This line is parallel to the x-axis. Due to increase in demand for the product, the new equilibrium is established at E1. Therefore, equilibrium quantity rises from OQ to OQ1. But equilibrium price, that is OP, it remains the same. Therefore, at this point we can say that the supply is perfectly elastic and we see here the case of increase in demand. The next case we are going to see under this is decrease in demand. What happens when there is decrease in demand? So here, if you will see the graph, when the demand decreases, that means from OQ, it is decreasing, from OQ, it is decreasing to OQ2. That means it is going towards the left hand side. We can see the supply curve is again the horizontal line at the x-axis. The price over here remains constant. Why? Because this decrease in demand is again a case of perfectly elastic. So therefore, the price remains the same. But the equilibrium point, that is E, will shift to the left hand side. Why? Because of the quantity, that is demand, is decreasing. So therefore, the equilibrium point from E shifts towards the left hand side and becomes E2. Because of the demand curve, or that is shifting because there is decrease in demand. Therefore, here we see the leftward shift. Next, the second case we are going to see here is when supply is perfectly inelastic. When supply is perfectly inelastic. In this case, children, you can see the graph where the price is mentioned on the y-axis and the quantity is mentioned on the x-axis. So what happens when the supply is perfectly inelastic? So when supply is perfectly inelastic, increase or decrease takes place of a commodity and it does not cause any change in its price in case demand for the commodity is perfectly elastic. Only the equilibrium quantity tends to change in case of perfectly elastic. But when it is inelastic, we see a situation of perfectly inelastic demand where the quantity remains constant but the price keeps on shifting. So over here, if you see this particular graph, OP is the price and OP1 is the new price, but the quantity, that is OQ, remains the same. So here we see the supply curve is parallel. The supply curve is parallel to y-axis, but the equilibrium point shifts or rises up. From E, it goes up to E1. Why so? because the price is increasing from P to P1. Therefore, over here we see a forward shift in the demand curve, that is shifting towards the right hand side. Now, what happens when supply is perfectly inelastic? We also see a case where the demand is decreasing. So if you will see the graph over here, there you can see that the price, it is going down from P to P2. Okay, the equilibrium that is achieved at point E also shifts down to E2. Therefore, we say that there is a backward shift. There is a backward shift when there is decrease in demand. This happens when the supply is perfectly inelastic. When supply is perfectly inelastic, we see two cases, that is increase in demand, where we see a forward shift, and decrease in demand where we see a backward shift. Is that clear, children? Next, we are going to see about the change in supply and equilibrium. What happens when there is change in supply and how the equilibrium is achieved? Again, we will see two cases. First, when demand is perfectly elastic, and the second case we will see when demand is perfectly inelastic. So let us discuss about the case where it is perfectly elastic. We all know what happens when it is perfectly elastic. The price remains the same. Okay. So increase or decrease in supply of a commodity, it doesn't change or doesn't affect the price of that particular commodity. So what kind of shift do we see? We see in this case, we have again two situations. We will see increase in supply, and another situation we will see decrease in supply. So here, if this is OP is the price and OQ is the original quantity, if I draw the curve, demand curve and the price, this particular demand curve will be this particular curve will be parallel to x-axis because price is constant. Over here, the supply curve, you can see this pink color line is the supply curve and E is the original quantity. So when there is increase in supply, what happens? In the perfectly elastic demand curve, we can see the forward shift in this because the quantity is changing from OQ to OQ1. So therefore, because the quantity is changing, quantity supplied is changing, we see a forward shift in the supply curve as well. So if you will see this dotted line of the supply curve, E1 is the new equilibrium point. Why does this equilibrium point change every time, children? Because to attain balance or to attain equilibrium, this point keeps on shifting. And how does it adjust itself? With the price being constant, the quantity that is changed, therefore regarding to the demand and the supply curve, the equilibrium point keeps on shifting. So here in this case, we see a forward shift. Next, what happens when there is decrease in supply? What happens when the decrease is there is decrease in supply? We see over here the supply curve will shift backward. Why? Because the quantity that is being demanded and supplied is becoming less. From OQ, it is going to OQ2. It is shifting backwards. It is going towards the left hand side. So suppose OP is the price and OQ is the quantity that is demanded. D is the demand curve that is again parallel to x-axis, and S is the supply curve. So the intersection of the demand and the supply curve, we attain equilibrium, fair enough. But what happens when there is decrease in supply? Then in this case, the quantity, as the quantity line shifts towards the left hand side, the supply curve will also shift towards the left hand side. Therefore, the equilibrium point shifts from E to E2 to attain equilibrium or to achieve equilibrium. Second case we see under this is when demand is perfectly inelastic. What happens when demand is perfectly inelastic? In this particular situation, we say that when demand is perfectly inelastic, we see that both the price over here, the price changes and the supply curve also changes. But what things remains constant? The quantity, this time the quantity remains constant and the price changes. So over here we see two situations. First, increase in supply situation, and second, decrease in supply situation. When the supply increases, okay, when the supply increases, the curve will shift towards the right hand side. Demand curve will be a vertical straight line which will be parallel to y axis. After that, we also notice due to increase in supply for the product, the new equilibrium that is achieved at point E1 instead of point E. So over here, the main role is played because of the quantity that is being constant. We see increase in supply and decrease in supply when demand is perfectly inelastic. So in this case, we see this particular line that the demand curve, and when it is intersecting the supply curve, both the supply curve, the new one and the old one, we see there is change or shift in the equilibrium point, and also the supply curve shifts towards the right hand side, and the price goes down from OP to OP1. So the second case that we see here is of decrease in supply. Now what do we see again in decrease in supply? The quantity is constant. The quantity in this case remains constant. The price, it increases from P to P2. So we see a backward shift. In this case, we see a backward shift, or it shifts towards the left hand side or left hand side. Now over here we see that the price is increasing from OP to OP2. Okay, the price is increasing from OP to OP2. So hence, if you see, the quantity is constant, therefore the demand curve will again be parallel to y-axis. So in this case, the supply curve at the original price, it was E, but when the price rises to P2, the curve shifts upwards to attain equilibrium, and henceforth we get the point E2 as our new equilibrium point. So these are the four cases that you have seen, children. The first case that you have seen about change in demand is that when demand is perfectly elastic, what happens? When demand is perfectly elastic, we have seen increase in demand and decrease in demand. When this supply is perfectly inelastic, we again have seen increase and decrease in demand. And the second one, when we talked about change in supply, the demand, when demand was perfectly elastic, we have seen increase in supply and decrease in supply. Also, when demand is perfectly inelastic, we have seen what happens to the supply curve when there is increase and decrease in supply. So here basically, children, we are talking about the shifting of the supply curve and the demand curve. Nothing else is shown here, nothing else difficult you will see. Only what happens when there are two types of situation. First, when it is perfectly elastic. Second, when it is perfectly inelastic. So what difference it makes when price or the quantity remains constant, or when there is decrease and increase in supply, or decrease in and increase in demand, both for the perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic situation. Next, we move on to some applications of this market form.